Daniel 9, as we last week looked, we saw that God was continuing to Daniel and through Daniel to reveal the things that were coming in the future. And this prophecy of Daniel, Daniel 9, the 70 weeks, is one of the most debated of the prophecies of the Old Testament. It's one that a lot of attention is given to, and there's a lot of confusion. I think probably a lot of overreading to it, and a lot of times people are trying to figure out exactly when these prophecies will occur. As we talked about in a conceptual level, certainly there was nothing wrong with that for Daniel. Daniel tried to know what these things were. We know in the Intertestament times, some of the prophecies Daniel made about the Greeks were seen and recognized in real time as they occurred. People saw that that was fulfillment of prophecy. Daniel himself knew by the prophecy of Jeremiah the time of the 70 years, and this Daniel 9 has that as a basis. And so there's a lot of folks trying to figure out the 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9. And as we mentioned last time, and we'll put the slides here, these 70 weeks were an answer to Daniel's prayer of repentance, that on behalf of the nation, that he prayed, and he prayed for the people and their sin. He prayed with sackcloth and ashes and fasting, time of great repentance. And he asked for the Lord to forgive. He also asked the Lord not just to do that on the basis of mercy for them, which they were surely and sorely needing, but also on the basis of his promise. It was for his city, the city called by your name. It was for your temple. It was on behalf of the holy mountain of my God. So the supplication for the holy mountain, the supplication for the holy city, and the prophecy of the 70 weeks that comes is going to be based on that. It's going to be on the basis of the temple, and it's going to be on the basis of the city as much as it is on the needs of the people. So those concerns of Daniel are addressed. And so as Daniel made that prayer, Gabriel came and answered to his prayer. As we're told, Gabriel said, as soon as you started praying, I was sent, and I'm going to give you explanation and understanding. I'm going to give you understanding in verse 22. So he says, consider the message, and he says, understand the vision. So that's an important thing for us to take note. When God gives a message, we are to consider it, and we're to do our best to understand it. Daniel will be told some of the things that are told him are not for his time. He will not be able to understand them, but he still sought to understand them. And we think about the New Testament statement of Peter about the prophecies of old, that the prophets made careful search and inquiry about what times the Spirit of Christ was indicating within them. So the prophecy now of this 70 weeks, I think we probably just should read the whole thing and see it in entirety. It's not that long. It's 4 verses. So it's only 4 verses, but it is some of the 4 verses of which the most amount of theological energy and ink and the like have been spilled over the time and over people trying to understand it. So there's going to be this restoration, and there's going to be destruction. So at the time that this prophecy was made, we recall the temple and the holy city lay uninhabited. They were in ruins. They had been in ruins for 50 plus years after the final destruction that Nebuchadnezzar had brought upon the rebellious people. We read about that in the book of Jeremiah. We read about that in the book of Ezekiel, and we read about in Ezekiel primarily its meaning as it occurred, explained to the exiles. So 50 years have passed, round number, that this city has been vacant, and there's nothing there. Daniel's prayer is, a good bit of that prayer is, Lord, we're sorry, we're going to do better. Please, we're going to try to do better. Could we please go back? And so there is seen in this a complete restoration. There will be a restoration of the city So that which Daniel sought for, that's going to occur. But it's not just a happily ever after passage at all. As a matter of fact, it's destruction and desolation is coming at the end. That's what's going to get them. And so it's going to be restoration, but then it's going to be destroyed yet again. And what we'll see, I think, can only be the things that are fulfilled in Jesus Christ and even fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus himself will make mention of this passage in the New Testament. So with all that, let's just read Daniel 9, verse 24. Beginning, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to bring the rebellion to an end, to put a stop to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this: from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until an anointed one, the ruler, will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So honestly, I don't know why it's quite broken up like this. We have 7 weeks and then 62, which in all will give us 69 weeks. Then there's going to be one more week, and that gets us 70. So it's sort of like a time telling in the book of Revelation, based on later things in Daniel, of time, times, and a half time. But kind of an odd way here of telling time, but one it seems as if you could possibly and probably understand. So 7 weeks, then 62. In that period, it will be rebuilt with a plaza and a moat, but in difficult times. And after those 62 weeks, the anointed one, or the Messiah, will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the coming ruler, or some translations will say prince, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come with a flood. And until the end, there will be war. Desolations are decreed. He will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to the sacrifice and offering. And the abomination of desolation will be on a wing of the temple until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. All right. One of the things is, in different translations, all of these things will come in slightly different form. It seems a hard section for the translators to deal with, and we have many different approaches from different translations as to how to best deal with this text and how to have some of these things. But this abomination of desolation, that will be that which that's the wrong thing. That'll be that which Jesus himself in Matthew 24 and also in the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus himself will see or will speak of. So we have this again as just a really broad summary. We have a complete restoration being built even in difficult and hard times, being built through oppression. But then we got that final week in which afterwards the anointed will be cut off. Then will come this desolation and destruction. And we will even have an end to the sacrifice. And so some of this, like the abomination of desolation, certainly seems to be AD 70. The ending of the sacrifice, there are some who view, and we'll get to this in a moment, there's some who view this as the work of Jesus to put an end to sacrifice, or there's some who see this as the Roman act of physically stopping the sacrifice. So Jesus obviated the need. Jesus, in the system and economy of God, put an end to sacrifice because he was sacrificed one time for all times. So there's a sense in which we could view Jesus as the ender of sacrifices, or there's another sense in which we could view the Romans as the ender of sacrifices. And both of those are going to be put forth by various commentators who try to deal with this passage. So again, we'll note, and I don't know how your translation even just typesets these words. But in the translation I just read from, those 4 verses are set in poetic form, like the Psalms. So it looks like the Psalms on the page. And it'd be real nice and neat in this translation if we had 4 sets of 8. If we had 32 lines. But in this translation, one of the verses in the middle there only has 7 lines, so we don't quite have that symmetry. But we certainly have poetic language, and I think trying to view it as literal and also I think trying to view it as a sequential set of events is also problematic. But viewing things as a sequential view of events is how we like to do things. And when we tell, we have people tell us stories, we kind of like them usually to tell the story in order. Of course, a really good storyteller doesn't have to tell the story in order. And sometimes by telling the story out of order, or telling it by topics, or telling it this and that, and using, flashbacks and going back and forth and the like, good storytellers can communicate a whole lot more than just a linear thing. So I do think this is, how we would say, non-linear. It's not sequential, I don't think, and we'll talk about that later in the lesson. So again, yes, Daniel, you're going to go back. They're going to rebuild it. They're going to put in the plaza. They're going to put in the moat. They're going to build it even though the times are difficult. In the next chapter, we'll see some of those difficult times. But then in verse 26, in this city will come the anointed one. This translation, or other translations, will say the Messiah, the Prince. And so the city that is going to be restored, the city that you're praying for, this people going from Babylon back to Jerusalem, that set of people in that circumstance, they're going to get to see the Messiah. So the Messiah is coming, and the Messiah is coming in about 70 weeks. 7 weeks, then 62 weeks. So there seems to be a startup period, then there's the big long period, but then there is that final week of great activity and great prophetic importance. So we have 70 weeks decreed. So we have all kinds of reference in this to time. It's one of the reasons why people try to sort it out. And I think we can probably and accurately sort this out as being matching up with the time of the Messiah. And again, in historic prophecy, I think there's any number of places we can do this where say this prophecy was given in this year, in this set of circumstances, especially with Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. They'll oftentimes tell us the year, and they'll tell us the location where they were when the prophecy was made. And then we'll see in other parts of the scripture that we wait long enough and we see the fulfillment. So the idea that a prophecy in real time is fulfilled in another real time after a certain passing of years, and sometimes people could understand that and see it happening in their own day, that is not a foreign concept to the Bible. The reason I keep bringing that up is, though, with the premillennial theory and dispensational theology, there's a lot of people think that this counting of weeks got stopped, that it didn't occur as God said was going to be, and as the prophets foresaw, that by the rejection of the Messiah, there was a stop to the Messianic clock. There's going to be a restoration of the Messiah in a physical kingdom in Israel, and these things will literally come to pass in the future. And when that clock starts up again, we're going to already be in the middle of the last week. We're going to be right at the end when the clock starts back up. And so when the clock starts back up, you don't know exactly when it's going to start up, but we think it's going to be soon. And when the clock starts back up, it won't take long to run out. That whole idea, which is this pregnant expectation of desolation and, or in some ways, a real pessimism. It's an apocalyptic pessimism that's in premillennialism. It comes from, either it's a misinterpretation of this passage, or they're reading that onto this passage. I don't know which is the chicken and which is the egg, but those two things go together. That kind of interpretation of this passage and that apocalyptic pessimism that says the clock's about to start, and when it does, we won't have much time then. We're right at the end. Now, this 70 weeks, as we start counting time, I think it's pretty obvious that the 70 weeks, or literally in in Hebrew and Greek, they didn't have a word for week. They called it the sevens. This it says quite literally 7 sevens is the seven of sevens, so to get the 70s. And so we're going to have this, basically it's 70 weeks, it's 70 weeks, which is 7 days, times 7, and we end up with 490 days. And it seems pretty obvious that in this case a day is a year. And so it seems pretty obvious, and this is pretty well acknowledged by all, that this prophecy of 70 weeks foresees a 490-year period. It foresees a 490-year period. And so just like, in the captivity, one of the reasons it was 70 years was because they had skipped 70 years worth of Sabbaths, as it were. They had skipped that many the years of Jubilee. And so until the land had its Sabbath, that's actually 2 Chronicles 36. They were carried away to Babylon, 2 Chronicles 36:21, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of desolation, it kept the Sabbath until 70 years were complete. So they had 70 years of Sabbath. Or some have rightly said, it's 70 years of Jubilee. They'd missed 70 Jubilees. And so the land got its rest all at once instead of once every 49 years, the 50th year. It got it all at once. So this 70 weeks, as we said, there's the 7 weeks, and then the 62, and then the final week. And so the long part will kind of be the calm part. Seems like the first 7 are kind of the rebuilding stage, more or less. The 62 are the long stage. There's troubles, but nothing that's an existential crisis, nothing that threatens their existence. But then we've got the big time of distress there in 25. There'll be difficult times. This translation says, or another translation says, the end of 25, there will be distressing times. So difficult or distressing. We also did note the same word in Chronicles as we had here in Daniel, which is the idea of desolation. That this, it was desolate when they were in captivity. And so desolation is not an invasion and a sacking. Desolation is not the enemy came and ran through the streets and carried off the gold and the booty and carried off some captives, and then put back the burn gates and went on. Desolation is a whole different category. Desolation is what Nebuchadnezzar did to the temple when he tore it down. And the only other time the temple gets desolated in that kind of desolation is what the Romans will do to it the generation after Jesus. And Jesus will talk about that abomination of desolations. So that's the other place from Matthew where we're familiar with that to come. So these times and weeks tell us, and tell Daniel's readers, there's a good long while for all these things to take place. There's a good long while for all these things to take place. And so if they understood in the ancient time that, basically these 70 weeks equal the 490 days, which means about 490 years, we would think then that somewhere around the time of Christ, there should have been people who saw that the Messiah would be coming based on this prophecy. As it turns out, in the time of Jesus, there was in Judea a great messianic fervor. There were many people who were expecting the Messiah. Jesus makes mention of this in the Matthew 24 passage of the false Christ who will come and lead many astray. And when John the Baptist showed up, there were a goodly number of people, we recall, who went out and questioned him and asked him if he were the Messiah that they had been waiting on. And there's other people who recognize in the work and ministry of Jesus, they see, he is the Messiah. And then other people dispute that. And in the Gospel of John, it's recorded, some said, well, when the Messiah comes, if this isn't him, will he do more miracles? And of course, the obvious answer is no, because Jesus is the one. And so there was a messianic fervor in the time of Jesus. Now, it's not the only time there ever was, but it seems that this prophecy, in the law and the things of the prophets, as the Apostle Paul would say it to the Galatians, the law was a tutor or schoolmaster to bring people to Christ. It seems that this prophecy did help bring people to Christ. Now, for those who take a literal, this is a 490-year prophecy, there are some difficulties in making it that. If you just make it a general number, it's about 490. If you make it round number and approximate number, you do away with a lot of difficulties, but you also kind of weaken the prophecy to make it more general than it might be. Because we know that God certainly has no trouble making very specific prophecies. 200 years before Cyrus would send the Jews home, right here in the year or two after Daniel makes this prayer. Isaiah mentions Cyrus by name a number of times, calls him my servant and my shepherd, and says what he's going to do. Those prophecies of Cyrus are so obvious and so striking that most people who don't believe in inspiration, they have to come up with a theory that the second half of Isaiah wasn't written when it said it was, back before the captivity even of Assyria, much less Babylon. They'll have to come up with a theory called Deutero-Isaiah, a second Isaiah who writes after the captivity, and he uses known history to backfill and write what appear to be prophecies after they've occurred. And so if you take a view of inspiration, that it is all sound, you go, no, God can make very specific prophecies, including names and dates. And so a lot of people count dates here, and they count this 490 years as a literal number. And I got to say, I'm highly inclined to do that myself. But if we count the years, we run into some issues. Cyrus made the decree because there was a decree mentioned that there's going to be this decree to go and restore and rebuild Jerusalem in verse 25. No one understand this: from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the Messiah, the Prince, comes, there are going to be this 70 weeks. And so from the decree to build the city to the Messiah is the main topic of this, the first part of this 70 weeks prophecy. Cyrus told the Jews to go home, and he told them that he'd been, he's given them instructions from God, and with the blessing of God, and according to what God says. Isaiah says, Cyrus is going to do this, and Cyrus did all this in the year 536 BC, which is just about the time Daniel has this vision. Well, if we count a literal number of years from the time of Cyrus's decree to, and subtract 490 years from that, we get to the year 46 BC. And if you know your history of the New Testament times, what momentous events happened in the year 46 BC? I'll wait. Yeah, but there just aren't any. There's nothing momentous. There's nothing messianic. There's no big developments in this plot, in the story, anywhere quite close to 46 BC. So as it turns out, a couple of years later, Darius, take your pick, Darius, he sent another decree confirming what Cyrus said, telling him to finish rebuilding the city and the temple. And that was in the year 521, 15 years later. And that gets us to 31 BC if we count down 490 years. And that doesn't do much for us either, does it? It just doesn't. But there's another one, though. In the book of Ezra, there is the decree by Artaxerxes, which happens in 458 BC. Ezra 7, verses 11 to 26 is one of these decrees that sure seems to be written by a prophet. This decree to go and do all the things that are commanded by the God of heaven with zeal for the house of the God of heaven. And this is when the temple really gets fully functioning, because Ezra takes with him all those priests and all those Levites. Artaxerxes gives to Ezra this decree to finish this city. And he makes that decree in 458 BC. Now, if we subtract 490 years from that date, it ends up being 33 AD. Now, anybody who's any kind of Bible student who knows a few years of Bible history, what do you know about the year 33 AD? That's the most likely date of the death of Christ. The most likely date of the death of Christ is April, and people have figured out what day the Passover was that year. I think it's either the 4th or the 6th. But anyway, April of 33 AD is the most likely time for the death of Jesus. And if this was a prophecy of 70 weeks from the rebuilding of the city, and that's the one that they count from, I got to say, that's pretty specific, and that would be hard to deny. Now, a couple of years later, I have to say, Artaxerxes gave another instruction to build the temple, to rebuild Jerusalem, pardon. He gave the instruction to Nehemiah to go and rebuild the walls, and that's the story of Nehemiah 5 and 6. They rose up to build, they put their hand to the work, they had a mind to the work, they worked near their house in 52 or 54 days, I forget. They finished the building of the city, and then they had the great dedication celebration with the great choruses at the city. Anyway, that decree to Nehemiah would have been a few years later, and that would have 490 years after that would have got us to 47 BC. So if we take that we can set and we can decide that this Artaxerxes declaration of 458 BC is the declaration mentioned in this prophecy, then we have exactly 490 years to the death of Christ, the ending of the sacrifice, the fulfillment of all those messianic prophecies. And that would be pretty strong, wouldn't it? It would be. Now, I have to say, if there's 4 to choose from, why is it we get to pick the one that fits? Well, because it fits. That's why we pick it, because it fits. If you were a skeptic, what would you say? Well, you got 4 of them, and 1 of them fits and 3 of them don't. So maybe you got a 25% chance. I'm not sure that's exactly. I'm not sure it's exactly 490 years. That's what it is. But if this prophecy is 490 exact years from the decree, then it seems like that's the decree we would start from, because that's the decree that makes it fit exactly. And that seems to be a tighter fit than coincidence would allow, doesn't it? I have to say, it's not ironclad. And if I was to argue against it, I'd have reason to argue against it. But in any case, it's very interesting, more than coincidence it seems. Now, I do have to say, like I say in the notes here, choosing this decree seems more clear in hindsight than in foresight. But actually, isn't that true of a number of prophecies? After the thing was done, it said, this is what was done. And you go, oh, that's what was done. I can see it now, when you couldn't see it in foresight. I think that I'm real sure this 70 weeks prophecy is the Messiah, and I think he's the one here that mentions is doing these things that will cut off and end the sacrifice, and I do think that it's a fulfilled prophecy, unlike as we mentioned a minute again, premillennial interpretations, which I think cause some problems, but. No matter what view we take of this prophecy, but I think it's worth looking at, but no matter what view of this prophecy we take, there's going to be some problems of interpretation. But we can clearly see, can we not, that God has a plan? That God had a plan for the city, God had a plan for the temple, God had a plan for the Messiah, and the destruction of it afterwards by the hands of the Romans. God seemed to have seen that too, didn't he? He saw all of that, and exactly how we can make the puzzle pieces fit it seems like some of the puzzle pieces fit in two places, and others fit them in none places. And if we put this one in, the other one doesn't fit. But if we take that one out, these other two fit real well. But then what do we do with the first one? Anyway, I think it's worth taking some time to study, because, like I say, this is one of the most used, and I think oftentimes most abused prophecies. But we know that God had a plan, and God saw what was going on. All right, does anybody have a question, a comment for me before we move on? I can't believe I explained it that well. I might take the option that I confused you that much. Well, as we go to the third page of the lesson, we have interpretation problems. Yes.
Is that called the preterist view, or is that, do you know?
Well, basically in this we get the preterist says that every prophecy is completely fulfilled. In some of the full preterists will say even prophecies of Jesus' second coming are already fulfilled in destruction of Jerusalem. And so this is basically the amillennial view, I guess. We're not going to be in the premillennial view, which says that any of this is yet to take place. So in that, the amillennial in this passage and the preterist have a lot in common. I think the simplest summary of preterist is that it's all been done, right? It's all past tense. It's all fulfilled prophecy. That every prophecy is fulfilled. And so the prophecies, even in the New Testament, that we look forward to, second coming of Jesus, that those things are already fulfilled. The preterist view is, I believe, a gross overreaction to premillennialism. Premillennialism says there is a massive number of prophecies that are unfulfilled. And they're all just waiting to happen at any moment. All of these things that the prophets foresaw in a, they call it a historical literary sense, but what they really mean is a literalistic sense. But one of the premillennial people I studied on this passage, they saw 6 promises. They broke down the promises at the end of this prophecy into 6 parts. And they said 4 were fulfilled and 2 remained. Now, at times you end up getting into things like partial preterism, that some is fulfilled and some is not. And some of the stuff that's called partial preterism, that actually kind of describes my view of things. But I would never consider myself, I guess, a partial preterist. But
that was my follow-up. I've heard people call themselves partial preterists, and since part of the prophecies have been fulfilled, could this be described as partial preterism?
Yeah, preterism is a really wide topic. The far end of it is, like I say, that there isn't even a prophecy of Jesus returning to earth in judgment. Even that's already been fulfilled. And it's certainly true that the prophecies of New Testament judgment, looking forward to the second coming of Christ and the final judgment, those prophecies use the language of and the imagery of Old Testament judgment passages and destruction of Jerusalem. Because, even when you talk about destruction of Jerusalem, it's like, well, which time, right? Because you got several to choose. There's a certain universality of judgment where all judgments are described, especially national judgments and apocalyptic type judgments. They have a lot of overlap in the way they're described, in the language and the scriptures of it. And so, the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds in judgment, to most people that sounds like second coming, because Jesus is going to return in the clouds. That's Acts 1, right? And he is going to judge the world, right? That's Hebrews 9 and other places. But that's language in Matthew 24 and other places in the New Testament. I think of destruction of Jerusalem. In Isaiah, you can find that same language in the destruction of Egypt, the destruction of Assyria. You can find that in places, the destruction of Babylon. So it's the language of national judgment. But every national judgment there is is some type and some form of the final judgment. Every judgment that God makes points to the fact that there's going to be a final judgment. So there's a lot of overlap in judgment language, and sometimes it's hard to sort out. And when we read, for instance, Matthew 24 and 25, because obviously some of that's destruction of Jerusalem. But obviously by the time we finish, some of that's talking about second coming. Unless you're a preterist, then it's all. And the preterists, man, they're consistent, but I think it's a false consistency. They will take every kind of national judgment and they'll say that never applies to the final judgment. But I think the final judgment is described in the same language as the national judgments. It's just eventually it'll be the judgment on all the nations. But so between the preterist and the premillennialist, and then folks like us who are pretty much amillennial, there's going to be a lot of dispute over what these octanes, group of 8. There's basically 4 groups of 8. What these words are portending, especially if you take them as a literal sequence. Now, we won't get to it this week, but we'll get to it next week, Lord willing. On the last page, right above the questions, I might just go ahead and direct your attention to that, let you look at it and study it for next time. We'll get to these interpretation problems, and we'll try not to rehash everything next week. And we'll talk a little bit more about premillennialism. We'll talk a little bit, one great quote, one theologian calls interpretation of this passage, he calls it one of the most notorious interpretive problems in the whole Old Testament. And then he also calls it, what people explain from this passage, he calls it a dismal swamp of exegesis. So that's a lovely set of words, a dismal swamp of explanation. Hopefully we've not gone into dismal swamp territory. Some may think we're off in the weeds and the mud too much already, but I hope not. But if you look at this, right above the questions, we have set the text into the form of a chiastic poem, which is a common way of Hebrew poetry, and is very common among the Psalms. But it's not a structure or kind of storytelling or information giving that we use much at all. And so we don't recognize it, I don't think, when we see it. And also, because it's in translation, I think it's all the more often hidden from us. And so I borrowed this. I didn't make this up myself. I borrowed it, where somebody looked at the first set of 8 things after the 70 weeks are decreed for the people in the holy city, and they see 6 promises. And so we step through 1 through 6, and then the next 3 verses are further explanation of those 6 things, but basically in reverse order that they're given. So as you see the structure on the page, it goes out to a point and then it comes back. So it's like an arrow point going out to something. It goes down and then it comes back. And the thing that's most important is the thing in the middle. And so it's not dealing with things, it's dealing with things in a priority fashion. It's not dealing with things in a chronological fashion. And if we take that view of this passage, I think it solves a whole lot of the issues that people have, especially of trying to say, well, these pieces have happened, but these people hasn't, and we're going to have these later. I think they've all happened, spoiler alert, but I think the structure of them being told is a chiastic, going out to the middle and then coming back. So there are things in life where we put the most important thing in the middle. Right? If a family is traveling together, where do they put the kids? In the middle, between mom and dad, right? And if you got baby in a car seat, where's the safest place to put that kid? You put you put that kid in the middle seat of the minivan. Why does that little baby get the middle of the middle? And then he's got an armored bucket around him, right? Because he's precious. We're trying to protect the kid. And so but we don't do that much in literature, right? Where the important thing is the very middle. Because when we're watching a film or we're reading a book, what's the middle part? It's what we're kind of slogging through to get to the conclusion. Because where do we normally put the important stuff? Either right at the top, or we build to it, it's right near the end, right? That's how we structure things. And so in a prophecy like this, where would we have a tendency to look to see what's important? Probably at the end. And what's at the end? Well, in this prophecy, the last thing chronologically, last thing in order talked about, the last thing is destruction of the temple. That's an important thing. There's no unimportant things here, right? In these 6 points. But I don't think that's the most important point. I think the most important point is the work of the Messiah. And guess what's right in the middle of this? The work of the Messiah. So, anyway, look at that for next week, and we'll do our best to conclude. I know we can talk about this. Like I told you that incident last week, the guy who starts studying his Bible, and he's so proud he gets a commentary for the whole Bible. And then later he gets a commentary for the New Testament. Oh, I got a book on just the New Testament. And later he gets a book just about one book of the Bible. And later he gets a book that the whole book is about one chapter of the Bible. And then eventually he gets one book that's about one verse of the Bible. He said, well, you can't go any deeper than that. Well, when the guy was telling the story, the book he had, which was the whole book on one verse, was from Daniel 9. There's not many places where you can buy a book about one verse of the Bible, but Daniel 9 is one of those places where you can get a whole book about one little section of Daniel. That's why we're spending a little more time on it. Partly also because if you run into people today who they count time, they think it's about the end of the world, they think the clock's about to start, they talk about the final week, this is where they're at, and we'll talk about why it is they think that, right? Again, the whole idea of counting time, that's not a crazy concept, but I don't think it applies to us in the time we're in. But there really was a messianic fervor in the time of Jesus, partly because people could see that this was the time. But that was the schoolmaster effect to take them to Christ. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for the premillennial theory. Now, that doesn't mean I don't like the people who hold it. A lot of my good friends are premillennialists. I have a lot of sympathy for premillennial people, but I don't have a lot of sympathy for premillennial explanations of Bible passages.